What if everything you thought you understood about life, time, power, love, and even reality itself was built on contradictions? Imagine chasing happiness only to find it vanishing, searching for meaning only to discover meaninglessness, or living forever only to realize eternity could destroy what makes life precious. From the mind-twisting puzzles of Zeno and the ship of Theseus, to the haunting questions of immortality, free will, and the meaning of existence, these paradoxes will not only challenge your beliefs, they will change how you see the world itself. So, stay with me till the end, because every paradox reveals a hidden truth you can't afford to miss. And if you're ready to go deeper into this journey of thought and self-discovery, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share this with someone who loves questioning reality as much as you do. The suicide paradox. The suicide paradox is one of the heaviest truths that humanity has wrestled with since the beginning of thought. At its heart lies a contradiction so painful that it cannot be ignored. The desire to end life as a way to escape suffering also ends the very possibility of life ever improving. It is a tragic loop, a decision born from despair that permanently removes the chance of future hope. When someone chooses suicide, they believe they are silencing pain once and for all. Yet, what they are also silencing are the unknown possibilities of healing, redemption, and transformation. And therein lies the paradox. An action meant to free a person from agony actually eliminates the very potential of freedom itself. Think of it this way. Suffering is rarely constant, even though in the darkest hours it feels endless. Human emotions shift like waves, and even the most crushing despair has moments where it weakens. But when someone chooses to end their life, they act as though their current state of pain defines eternity, as though no change will ever arrive. This belief, though powerful, is not the truth. Pain evolves, situations change, and human resilience often surprises us with its strength. Yet suicide seals time at its lowest point, cutting off the possibility of tomorrow's sunrise, tomorrow's laughter, tomorrow's healing. The paradox is that in trying to end pain, the act also ends the very possibility of discovering life beyond that pain. On a deeper level, the suicide paradox forces us to question the meaning of existence itself. Why do we endure? Why do some hold on while others let go? To many, life is only valuable if it feels good, if it brings joy, success, or love. But the paradox reveals another layer of truth. Meaning is not always found in comfort. Sometimes meaning is born in suffering itself, in surviving it, in understanding it, and in transforming it into strength. Many of the greatest artists, thinkers, and leaders in history once stood at the edge of despair. They questioned their existence, felt the pull of darkness, and yet chose to keep going. Their survival became the very reason others found light. The tragedy is that those who give up often never realize how close they were to discovering a deeper purpose. The paradox whispers this cruel irony. Those who believe they have nothing left to give may actually hold within them the power to change countless lives, including their own. This paradox also stretches into the fabric of relationships. Suicide does not just end an individual life. It ripples outward, leaving scars on families, friends, and communities. A person may feel invisible, unnecessary, or unloved, yet their departure often reveals how deeply they were valued, how profoundly their absence is felt. The paradox grows heavier here. In seeking to escape loneliness or insignificance, the act of suicide often proves just how significant and irreplaceable that person truly was. What they failed to see in life becomes painfully clear in their death, to others, and tragically, too late for themselves. The suicide paradox also exposes the illusion of control. In a way, suicide is an attempt to reclaim power when everything else feels uncontrollable. Life feels overwhelming, pain feels unshakable, and the choice to end it seems like the ultimate decision, the one thing left within one's command. But the paradox is cruel, because the final act of control results in the loss of all future choices. In ending life, one surrenders every possibility of change, every new path, every unforeseen opportunity. What feels like empowerment is, in truth, the most permanent surrender. And perhaps the most haunting layer of this paradox is time itself. Human beings are notoriously bad at predicting the future of their own emotions. What feels unbearable today may feel lighter tomorrow. What feels hopeless in this moment may shift with one new experience, one new relationship, one new purpose discovered by chance. Yet the finality of suicide ignores this truth, acting as though the present moment is permanent. The paradox here is sharp. Suicide ends a life that may have held a turning point just beyond the horizon. A single day lived longer could have revealed a door out of the darkness, but the choice to end it all ensures that door is never reached. In the end, the suicide paradox is not merely about death. It is about perspective. It forces us to confront how fragile human hope can be, but also how deceptive despair is when it convinces us that tomorrow holds nothing. It reveals how the desire to escape pain can collide with the very essence of what it means to be alive, the chance for growth, renewal, and change. The paradox stands as both a warning and a plea, a warning that life's darkest moments can blind us to possibilities, and a plea to hold on just long enough to see what lies beyond the storm. Because the cruel truth is that by ending life, one may unknowingly end just before the story was about to change. The Immortality Paradox. The Immortality Paradox is one of the most fascinating and unsettling ideas in philosophy because it forces us to question whether eternal life would truly be a blessing or whether it would slowly become the greatest curse imaginable. On the surface, immortality sounds like the ultimate dream. Imagine endless years to experience every adventure, every skill, every passion. Imagine centuries to master every language, to explore every continent, to travel to other worlds, to watch history unfold with your own eyes. At first, the idea of never dying feels like freedom. Freedom from fear, freedom from loss, freedom from the ticking clock that governs every human life. But when we look deeper, the paradox emerges. Would life without death actually strip existence of the very meaning that makes it precious? Human life is defined by time. Every moment we experience gains its value from the fact that it will not last forever. A child's laughter is cherished because it fades into adulthood. A beautiful sunset moves us because the light quickly vanishes into night. Even love itself is heightened by the awareness that one day we may lose it, that one day we ourselves will be gone. Mortality creates urgency, and urgency gives rise to meaning. Without death to frame life, every moment risks becoming empty, stretched into an endless repetition. The Immortality Paradox forces us to ask, if you could live forever, would anything really matter anymore? At first, you might think yes. Of course it would. With unlimited time, you could achieve greatness beyond imagination. But imagine living not just for 100 years or 1,000, but for 1,000,000. Imagine watching empires rise and fall, civilizations crumble, and the people you once loved turn to dust. Imagine learning everything there is to know, mastering every skill, solving every mystery until one new is left. Immortality begins to reveal its hidden darkness, the weight of endless existence, the loneliness of outliving everyone you care about, the boredom of having nothing left to strive for. What once felt like a gift becomes a burden too heavy for the human soul to bear. The paradox becomes clearer when you realize that the very thing humans fear most, death, might be the very thing that makes life beautiful. Mortality forces us to make choices, to treasure fleeting moments, to live fully because time is limited. Immortality, on the other hand, erases this urgency. If you live forever, why hurry to accomplish anything? Why value one moment over another when you know there will always be more? Eternity robs life of its sharp edges, softens its urgency, and can dissolve its meaning into an endless blur. The paradox is cruel. The dream of eternal life risks becoming the nightmare of eternal emptiness. There's also the question of identity. Human beings are shaped by beginnings and endings. Childhood ends, love stories begin and close, careers start and finish, lives follow a path with a destination. But if there is no end, who do you become? If you are not defined by death, then what defines you? Without the boundary of mortality, identity itself may blur, stretch thin across centuries until you no longer recognize who you once were. The paradox deepens. In trying to escape death, you may also escape yourself. And what about relationships? Imagine falling in love, knowing you will live forever while the person beside you will not. You will hold their hand through time, only to watch them fade, while you remain untouched. You may love again and lose again, endlessly, until the pain of repeated goodbyes becomes unbearable. Or imagine if everyone was immortal. Families would never pass, generations would never change. Society might collapse under the weight of endless lives. Without death, the natural cycle of renewal vanishes, leaving the world frozen in an eternal standstill. The Immortality Paradox also raises moral and spiritual questions. Many religions promise eternal life as the ultimate reward, but perhaps eternity is not as simple as it seems. Is eternal existence really paradise, or could it be another kind of trial? Some philosophers argue that even in heaven, an eternity of bliss might lose its meaning. Pleasure only feels good when contrasted with struggle. Without that contrast, even perfection could eventually become hollow. The paradox warns us that eternity, instead of solving the problem of death, may actually create a new problem, the death of meaning itself. At its core, the Immortality Paradox reveals that our fear of death might be misplaced. Death is not simply the enemy. It is the frame that gives life its picture, the silence that makes music possible, the shadow that makes light meaningful. Without death, there may be no true life at all. And so, the paradox forces us to reconsider what it means to live fully. Perhaps it is not about stretching existence into eternity, but about embracing its brevity, cherishing its fragility, and finding beauty in the fact that every moment will pass. In other words, life's value comes not from lasting forever, but from being unrepeatable. The Prisoner's Dilemma Paradox. The Prisoner's Dilemma Paradox is one of the most powerful illustrations of human conflict, trust, and decision-making, because it reveals how rational individuals can make choices that lead to irrational, damaging outcomes. At its surface, it seems like a simple problem of strategy, but when expanded, it becomes a mirror reflecting human nature, our fears, our suspicions, and the fragile fabric of cooperation that society depends on. The story is straightforward. Two prisoners are arrested for a crime and kept in separate cells with no way of communicating. The prosecutors offer them a deal. If both remain silent, refusing to betray each other, they each serve a short sentence. If one betrays the other while the other stays silent, the betrayer goes free while the silent one suffers a long punishment. But if both betray, they both end up with heavy sentences. Logically, the best outcome for both is silence, cooperation. Yet human nature often drives both to betray, fearing that the other might betray first. The paradox lies here. When each individual acts in their own self-interest, both end up worse off than if they had trusted each other. On the surface, this paradox is about crime and punishment, but in truth, it represents much more. It reflects the tension between trust and fear, between self-preservation and collective well-being. The dilemma shows us how difficult cooperation really is, not just for prisoners, but for all people in all parts of life. Nations arm themselves, fearing betrayal by others, even when peace would serve them better. Businesses compete ruthlessly, undercutting each other, even when collaboration could bring mutual growth. Even in personal relationships, people withhold love or honesty, fearing rejection, and in doing so, create the very distance they feared in the first place. The deeper tragedy of the Prisoner's Dilemma is how it exposes the fragility of trust. Trust is the invisible glue that holds families, friendships, and entire societies together. But trust is always vulnerable because it requires belief in another person's choice, something we cannot control. And when the stakes are high, fear often speaks louder than trust. The paradox shows that even when two people want the same positive outcome, fear of betrayal can lead them into mutual destruction. Cooperation, which seems so simple, becomes the hardest choice of all when the cost of being wrong feels unbearable. From a psychological standpoint, the dilemma forces us to confront the way humans perceive risk. We are naturally loss-averse, meaning the pain of loss feels stronger than the joy of gain. So, in the prisoner's position, the possibility of being betrayed and receiving the worst outcome feels unbearable, even if staying silent could bring the best outcome. Fear of loss pushes individuals toward betrayal, even when trust would have served them better. This reveals a haunting truth. Human beings are not always logical creatures. We calculate through emotion, and fear often wins over reason. The paradox also echoes in global issues like war and politics. Nations often find themselves in a prisoner's dilemma. Both sides would benefit from peace, disarmament, or cooperation. But because each fears the other's betrayal, they invest in weapons, wage wars, or act aggressively, creating the very conflict they wish to avoid. The Cold War was a living example of this paradox. Two superpowers locked in a dangerous standoff, both terrified of betrayal, and yet both creating more danger by their mutual mistrust. The paradox becomes a cycle. Mistrust breeds mistrust, fear creates fear, and betrayal becomes almost inevitable. Yet, hidden within the prisoner's dilemma is also a lesson about the power of repeated choices. When the game is played once, betrayal seems logical, but when it is played again and again, people learn the value of cooperation. Over time, trust can build, and betrayal can become less attractive because the long-term benefits of cooperation outweigh the short-term gain of selfishness. This reveals another layer of the paradox. While fear drives us toward betrayal, experience and patience can teach us that trust is the more powerful strategy. The dilemma also invites us to reflect inwardly on our personal lives. How often do we betray ourselves out of fear? How often do we choose the safe, selfish path because we don't trust that others will stand with us? In relationships, we sometimes hold back vulnerability, fearing rejection, but in doing so, we create distance and loneliness. In business or friendship, we sometimes compete when we could collaborate, fearing that others won't share openly. The paradox reminds us that mistrust can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. In expecting betrayal, we often create the conditions that bring it about. At its heart, the prisoner's dilemma, paradox, is not just about two prisoners in a cell. It is about every one of us, every day. It is about nations and families, strangers and lovers, colleagues and friends. It is about the choice between trust and fear, between cooperation and betrayal. And the lesson it whispers is profound. The path of self-preservation may seem safe, but it often leads to greater loss. The path of trust, though risky, may be the only way to create a world where we all win together. The paradox asks us to look beyond fear and see the power of cooperation, not as weakness, but as the greatest form of strength humanity can achieve. The paradox of war for peace. The paradox of war for peace is one of the most unsettling contradictions of human civilization. It is the idea that nations and leaders often justify war by claiming it is necessary to create peace. Yet the very act of fighting destroys the stability and harmony they claim to seek. At its core, it raises a painful question. Can peace ever truly be achieved through violence, or does violence only plant the seeds for more conflict? This paradox has haunted humanity for thousands of years, shaping history, philosophy, and even our personal sense of morality. At first glance, the logic of war for peace seems almost reasonable. When faced with a threat, a nation believes it must fight to defend itself, to eliminate danger, and to secure safety for future generations. Leaders declare that sacrifices must be made today, so that children may grow up in a world without fear tomorrow. This narrative has been used throughout history, from ancient empires to modern wars. Yet the paradox reveals itself immediately. In trying to build a future of peace, war often destroys the very foundations of peace: trust, stability, and the value of human life. The streets that were meant to be safe are left in ruins, and the generations that were meant to be protected are instead scarred by the memories of violence. History is filled with examples of this paradox. The First World War was once called the war to end all wars. Millions died with the belief that their sacrifice would make the world safer. Yet barely 2 decades later, the Second World War erupted, even bloodier and more destructive. Each war was justified in the name of peace, yet each war only paved the way for the next. This cycle reveals the tragic truth. Violence does not erase violence. It often multiplies it. Every war fought leaves behind wounds, resentments, and grievances that spark new conflicts. The paradox is that in trying to force peace through violence, we often create the exact opposite: endless chains of revenge and retaliation. The paradox also highlights the moral contradiction within human nature. We value peace, yet we so often choose violence as the tool to achieve it. Leaders, soldiers, and even citizens may believe they are fighting for justice, yet the methods they use often mirror the injustice they seek to destroy. To kill in order to stop killing, to destroy in order to build. These are contradictions that reveal the complexity of human morality. On the surface, war for peace seems like a noble cause, but when stripped down, it forces us to ask whether the means ever truly justify the end. On a psychological level, the paradox of war for peace speaks to the fear that drives human behavior. People often believe peace cannot be trusted unless it is secured through dominance. Nations fear being vulnerable, so they build weapons, create armies, and prepare for war in the name of defense. But this preparation itself breeds tension. One side's weapons are seen as threats by the other, leading to arms races, mistrust, and eventually the wars they claim to prevent. It becomes a vicious cycle where fear creates the very danger it was meant to avoid. In trying to secure peace, war becomes inevitable. This paradox doesn't just exist on the battlefield. It exists within the human heart. On a personal level, how often do we fight with others believing it will bring peace to the relationship? We lash out, raise our voices, or act with anger in the hope that the conflict will finally be settled. Yet our aggression rarely creates peace. It usually deepens the divide. Just like nations, individuals sometimes choose war, arguments, hostility, or harshness, believing it will solve problems, when in truth, it only creates more pain. The paradox is that peace often requires the opposite of war: patience, dialogue, forgiveness, but those are the very things fear convinces us to avoid. And yet, the paradox of war for peace also holds a warning we cannot ignore. It reminds us that while war may sometimes seem like the fastest road to peace, it is often the longest and most destructive path. True peace cannot be built on fear, domination, or the ashes of violence. It requires trust, cooperation, and an understanding that enemies cannot be destroyed into becoming friends. Peace forged through war is fragile, temporary, and often an illusion. Only peace built on compassion and understanding can last. In the end, this paradox forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth about humanity. We desire peace, but too often pursue it through destruction. We want safety, but create danger. We want unity, but sow division. We want freedom, but wage wars that chain generations to grief. The paradox of war for peace is not just about nations. It is about us, about the choices we make in our own lives. And it whispers a difficult lesson. Real peace is never achieved by fighting harder. It is achieved by understanding deeper. The happiness paradox. The happiness paradox is one of the most profound contradictions of the human condition. It says that the harder you try to pursue happiness directly, the more it seems to slip through your fingers. At first, this seems absurd. Isn't the pursuit of happiness what life is all about? Don't we strive, work, and sacrifice in order to be happy? Yet when we chase it as our ultimate goal, happiness often becomes elusive. Instead of feeling fulfilled, we find ourselves restless, anxious, and disappointed. This paradox forces us to question not just how to live, but what happiness actually is. The paradox begins with desire. Human beings naturally want to feel joy, love, and contentment. We pursue success, relationships, wealth, or pleasure because we believe they will make us happy. And sometimes they do, but only briefly. The promotion at work, the dream car, the vacation, or even the new relationship often brings a rush of excitement that quickly fades. Psychologists call this the hedonic treadmill, the tendency to adapt quickly to new circumstances, always returning to the same emotional baseline. What once felt extraordinary becomes ordinary, and the chase begins again. The paradox is cruel. The more we grasp for happiness through external achievements, the faster it slips away, leaving us emptier than before. On a deeper level, the happiness paradox exposes a flaw in our understanding of happiness itself. We often confuse happiness with pleasure, thinking it comes from comfort, indulgence, or constant positivity. But pleasure fades, comfort becomes boring, and positivity without struggle feels shallow. True happiness, paradoxically, often arises not from chasing it directly, but from engaging deeply in things beyond ourselves: meaning, purpose, love, creativity, or growth. When we stop obsessing over being happy and instead focus on living with intention, happiness often appears quietly as a byproduct. It is like a shadow. It follows when you walk toward meaning, but vanishes when you try to grab it. The paradox also shows up in relationships. Many people desperately seek love because they believe it will finally make them happy. Yet the more desperate the search, the more fragile and unsatisfying the relationships become. Happiness in love often comes not from hunting for the perfect partner, but from building connection, patience, and authenticity. The same is true in friendships, careers, or passions. The more we demand happiness from them, the less they deliver. The more we invest in the process itself, the more joy naturally arises. Another layer of the paradox is revealed in suffering. Strangely, happiness often grows out of struggle, challenge, and even pain. Think about the satisfaction of overcoming a difficult obstacle, the pride of mastering a skill after years of effort, or the joy of healing after heartbreak. These forms of happiness are not shallow bursts of pleasure. They are deep, enduring, and meaningful. Yet, if we avoided all discomfort in the pursuit of constant happiness, we would miss these richer forms of joy. The paradox teaches us that happiness and suffering are not opposites but partners. Without struggle, happiness loses its depth. Without contrast, joy loses its meaning. On a philosophical level, the happiness paradox asks us to rethink the entire purpose of life. If happiness cannot be caught by chasing it, then what should we pursue? The answer may lie in values greater than ourselves: growth, contribution, creativity, and love. People who devote their lives to a cause often find themselves happier than those who simply chase pleasure. Artists who lose themselves in creation, parents who sacrifice for their children, leaders who dedicate themselves to service. These people may not always feel happy in the shallow sense, but their lives radiate fulfillment. The paradox shows us that happiness is not found by asking, "How can I be happy?" but by asking, "What is worth living for?" The paradox also serves as a warning in our modern world. Consumer culture constantly tells us happiness can be bought in clothes, gadgets, or lifestyles. Social media reinforces the illusion by displaying curated images of joy and success, making us believe that happiness is a product we must chase. But the more we consume, compare, and grasp, the more dissatisfied we become. The happiness paradox unmasks this illusion. Happiness cannot be consumed, only cultivated. It is not a product of taking, but of giving, not of chasing, but of living fully. In the end, the happiness paradox teaches a counterintuitive truth. To find happiness, stop chasing it. Focus instead on meaning, growth, and presence. Engage deeply with the people you love, the work you value, and the life that unfolds in front of you. Happiness will not come when you demand it. It will come when you live in such a way that you no longer need to demand it. It will not come as the prize at the end of a chase, but as the quiet companion of a meaningful life. The paradox is not a curse, but a reminder. Happiness is not something we get. It is something we become. The time travel paradox. The time travel paradox is one of the most intriguing and mind-bending contradictions ever imagined. It emerges when we ask, what would happen if we could move backward in time and change the past? At first, the idea of traveling through time feels like pure wonder, the chance to revisit lost moments, correct mistakes, or even stop tragedies before they happen. Yet, as soon as we imagine making even the smallest change, a web of contradictions begins to form. The paradox lies in the fact that if you alter the past, you may unravel the very conditions that made your journey possible in the first place. In other words, the act of changing the past can prevent the future that allowed you to change it. One of the most famous examples is the grandfather paradox. Imagine traveling back in time and preventing your grandfather from meeting your grandmother. If you succeed, then your parent would never be born, and neither would you. But if you were never born, then how could you have traveled back in time in the first place to stop them from meeting? The loop collapses in on itself, creating a logical impossibility. The paradox shows us that time travel is not just a question of physics, but of logic, causality, and even identity. The paradox becomes even more complex when we consider small changes instead of big ones. What if you go back and step on a single insect? What if you delay someone by just a few seconds, causing them to miss a bus? That bus might have carried a future leader, a future inventor, or even your own ancestor. A tiny alteration could ripple outward into massive consequences, changing the course of history. This is often called the butterfly effect, and it deepens the paradox. If one small action in the past reshapes the future, then the future you came from might never exist. And if it never existed, how could you have return? 80 to the past at all? The time travel paradox also raises questions about destiny and free will. If time can be changed, then the future is not fixed. But if every attempt to change the past creates contradictions, perhaps the timeline is rigid, unbreakable, and self-correcting. Some theories suggest that even if you travel to the past, your actions are already part of history, and therefore you cannot actually change anything. You can only fulfill what has already happened. In this view, trying to stop a tragedy might only ensure it happens exactly as it always did. The paradox here is chilling. In trying to fight destiny, you may end up creating it. On the other hand, some philosophers and scientists propose the idea of multiple timelines or parallel universes. In this view, going back in time does not erase your own future, but creates a new branch of reality. If you prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother, you would simply create a new world where you were never born. While in your original world, you still exist. But this solution leads to its own paradox. If every choice creates an infinite number of universes, then where do they all exist? And what does it mean for your reality? If everything happens in some universe, then does choice itself lose meaning? The paradox isn't only about science, it also speaks to our psychology. Human beings are obsessed with the idea of undoing mistakes. We fantasize about going back to say the right words, to take the right chance, to avoid the wrong decision. The time travel paradox reflects the longing inside us for second chances, but it also carries a hidden lesson. If changing the past creates endless contradictions, maybe the only place where we truly have power is in the present. Perhaps the paradox is reminding us that, while the past cannot be rewritten, the future is always being written right now. Another haunting layer of this paradox is identity. If you change the past, do you also change who you are? Our lives are built from every moment, every decision, every experience, even the painful ones. If you erase them, you erase the person they created. If you stop your own suffering in the past, you might also prevent yourself from becoming the person strong enough to survive it. In this way, the paradox whispers a warning. Changing the past may also erase the very self who longed to change it. Ultimately, the time travel paradox is not just about science fiction, it is about existence itself. It forces us to ask what time really is: a straight line, a circle, or an infinite web of possibilities. It challenges our ideas of cause and effect, reminding us that the present is tied to the past in ways we may never fully untangle. And it teaches us a sobering truth. Perhaps the reason time travel remains impossible is not because technology cannot achieve it, but because reality itself is built on laws that would collapse under the weight of such contradictions. The paradox protects the order of the universe by making the impossible truly impossible. In the end, the time travel paradox leaves us with a profound reflection. Maybe we are not meant to live in the past or manipulate it. Maybe the only way forward is to accept the past as it is, and recognize that its power lies not in being changed, but in shaping who we are. The past is unmovable, the future is unknown, and the present is the only place where life can truly be lived. The Fermi Paradox. The Fermi Paradox is one of the greatest mysteries of science, philosophy, and human existence. It begins with a simple, haunting question. If the universe is so vast, so ancient, and filled with billions of stars and potentially habitable planets, then where is everybody? Why, after decades of searching, have we found no clear evidence of intelligent life beyond Earth? On the surface, the logic seems undeniable. If life arose here, then surely it must have arisen elsewhere. The galaxy alone has hundreds of billions of stars, and many of them have planets that could support life. Given enough time, even one advanced civilization should have spread across the stars, leaving traces we could detect, and yet, the silence of the cosmos remains absolute. This silence is the paradox, the expectation of life everywhere colliding with the reality of finding none. To grasp the weight of the Fermi Paradox, consider the scale of the universe. The Milky Way is over 100,000 light-years across, and within it lie hundreds of billions of planets. Astronomers estimate that billions of these planets sit within the habitable zone, the sweet spot where liquid water could exist, and with it, the possibility of life. If life began on Earth relatively quickly after the planet formed, then shouldn't it also have begun elsewhere? And if intelligence evolved here, why not there? Statistically, the odds seem overwhelming that we should not be alone, but the universe offers us only silence, and this silence grows more unsettling the more we listen. One possible explanation is that intelligent life is extremely rare. Perhaps the conditions that made Earth perfect for life are so unique that no other planet has duplicated them. Maybe the development of intelligence is far less likely than we assume. Countless planets might hold bacteria or simple organisms, but never the spark, of consciousness. If this is true, then humanity is unimaginably rare, a cosmic miracle in a universe mostly silent and lifeless. The paradox then becomes a reminder of our fragility and uniqueness. Another possibility is that civilizations do arise, but they destroy themselves before spreading far. Nuclear war, climate collapse, pandemics, or technologies beyond our control might end civilizations before they ever reach the stars. This is called the Great Filter, a barrier that most life cannot pass. If the Great Filter is behind us, then humanity is special, having beaten impossible odds to exist. But if the Great Filter is ahead of us, then the silence of the cosmos is a grim warning. Perhaps every intelligent species eventually engineers its own destruction. The paradox becomes not just a question of where others are, but whether we ourselves can survive long enough to avoid joining them in silence. Yet another explanation is that advanced civilizations are out there, but they are hiding. Perhaps they see us, but choose not to reveal themselves, just as humans might avoid disturbing a nest of ants. This is sometimes called the zoo hypothesis, the idea that Earth is being observed, but not contacted. If true, the paradox is not a silence of absence, but a silence of choice. We are children in a cosmic zoo, unaware of the keepers who watch from afar. Others suggest that advanced life might be so far beyond us that we cannot even recognize it. Just as an ant cannot comprehend the complexity of human society, perhaps we cannot comprehend the signals or structures of civilizations millions of years older than us. They may communicate in ways we cannot detect, use energy on scales we cannot imagine, or exist in forms we cannot recognize. The paradox here is humbling. We may not be alone, but our perspective is too limited to see beyond ourselves.
The Fermi Paradox also forces us to question time itself. The universe is nearly 14 billion years old. Humanity has existed for only a blink of an eye. What if civilizations rise and fall on timescales that rarely overlap? Maybe countless civilizations have existed, but their lights burned out long before we arrived, or they will emerge long after we are gone. The silence of the stars could be the silence between civilizations, separated not by distance but by time. But perhaps the most haunting possibility is the simplest one. Maybe we truly are alone. If that is the case, then the paradox is not just a scientific puzzle, but an existential weight. It would mean that consciousness, love, creativity, and thought exist nowhere else in the cosmos but here on this small planet. That we, fragile humans clinging to a pale blue dot, carry the only light of awareness in an otherwise indifferent universe. The silence of the Fermi Paradox would then be a call, not to despair, but to responsibility. If we are the only voice in the void, then preserving life, intelligence, and meaning becomes not just a human duty, but a cosmic one. Ultimately, the Fermi Paradox is more than a question of aliens. It is a question of us. It forces us to confront the limits of our knowledge, the fragility of our survival, and the possibility that we are far more rare, or far more doomed, than we want to believe. Whether the silence means we are alone, or that others are simply beyond our reach, the paradox calls us to look up at the stars with both awe and humility. For in the silence of the universe, we hear both the mystery of what is missing and the echo of our own fragile existence. The free will paradox sits at the heart of philosophy, psychology, and even spirituality because it questions one of the most fundamental aspects of human existence. Do we truly have the freedom to make our own choices, or are all of our actions determined by forces beyond our control? On one hand, we feel free. We wake up, choose what to wear, decide what to eat, and believe that every choice reflects our personal will. On the other hand, science, logic, and even certain religious doctrines suggest that free will may be an illusion. The paradox lies in this tension. If everything is determined by biology, environment, or destiny, then free will cannot exist. But if free will does exist, then how can it exist within a universe governed by laws, causality, and reason? At its simplest, the paradox asks, if every action has a cause, then are we truly free? Imagine tracing your decisions backward. You chose to drink coffee this morning. Why? Because you enjoy the taste, or because it gives you energy. But why do you enjoy the taste? Because of your genetics and past experiences. Why do you need the energy? Because of your circumstances, your sleep, your body's needs. If every decision can be explained by causes before it, genetics, upbringing, culture, even the firing of neurons in the brain, then where does free will fit? The paradox suggests that what feels like freedom may simply be the outcome of forces you never chose in the first place. Science adds more weight to this dilemma. Neuroscientific studies have shown that the brain often begins to prepare for a decision before we are even aware of making it. In experiments, scientists can sometimes predict whether a person will press a button seconds before the person consciously decides. If the brain decides before the mind does, then perhaps free will is just our conscious mind catching up. Religion and spirituality add their own twists. Some traditions claim that destiny is written, that every event unfolds according to divine will. Yet the same traditions often urge humans to make moral choices, as though those choices were freely made. The paradox here is clear. How can we be judged for choices that were never truly ours? On the other hand, some spiritual perspectives argue that free will is real, but only within the boundaries of a larger design. We are free to choose, but only on a stage already built by forces greater than ourselves. The paradox also touches every ordinary life in subtle ways. When you regret a choice, you feel as though you could have chosen differently. But could you really? When you admire someone for their courage, you assume they could have been cowardly instead. But was their bravery just the only path their life could take, given who they were and what shaped them? Even in love, we feel as though we freely chose our partners. But were we not influenced by attraction, shaped by biology, culture, and unconscious drives? Every moment of life is haunted by the question, am I really choosing, or am I only following a script I cannot see? And yet perhaps the paradox itself holds the answer. Maybe free will and determinism are not opposites, but partners. Maybe our lives are like rivers. The water must flow downhill, guided by gravity and terrain. But within those constraints, it still moves, swirls, and changes its path. Perhaps we are shaped by causes beyond our control, yet still capable of directing our course within those boundaries. The paradox reminds us that freedom is not absolute, but neither is control. We are not gods writing reality from scratch, nor are we puppets on invisible strings. We are something in between, bound and free, determined and choosing. In the end, the free will paradox forces us to confront the paradox of tolerance. The paradox of tolerance is one of the most unsettling challenges in ethics, politics, and social philosophy. It begins with a question that seems simple. Should a tolerant society tolerate everything, even intolerance itself? At first, tolerance feels like an absolute good. To be tolerant means to allow different ideas, cultures, beliefs, and voices to coexist peacefully. Tolerance creates diversity, harmony, and freedom. But here lies the paradox. If a society tolerates intolerance completely, then intolerance will eventually destroy tolerance. In other words, unlimited tolerance can lead to the end of tolerance itself. This paradox was first famously articulated by philosopher Karl Popper. He argued that if we allow the enemies of tolerance to spread their hatred unchecked, they will eventually gain the power to silence tolerance itself. For example, if a tolerant society permits intolerant groups to freely promote violence, discrimination, or oppression, then sooner or later those intolerant groups may dominate, and tolerance will collapse. Thus, tolerance requires a boundary. But where should that boundary be drawn? How much intolerance can be tolerated before it becomes a threat to tolerance itself? That is the heart of the paradox. On a deeper level, the paradox of tolerance reveals the fragility of freedom. We want to believe that all voices should be heard, that open dialogue will eventually lead to truth, and that the marketplace of ideas will filter out hatred and falsehood. But history shows that this is not always the case. Intolerant ideologies, once given space, often grow like fire. They exploit the very freedom they despise, using tolerance as a shield until they are strong enough to strike it down. We saw this in the rise of fascism in the 20th century, when movements that began with free speech and political participation. The paradox also forces us to examine the difference between ideas and actions. Tolerating a belief may be harmless if it remains private. But when intolerance turns into action, when it seeks to silence, oppress, or harm others, then tolerance must draw a line. The difficulty is knowing where belief ends and action begins, and how much danger must be present before society is justified in resisting. This tension is what makes the paradox so enduring. There are no easy answers, only difficult balances. Ultimately, the paradox of tolerance teaches us that tolerance is not weakness, nor is it the absence of judgment. True tolerance requires strength, wisdom, and courage. It requires us to protect the very principles that allow freedom, diversity, and peace to exist. Unlimited tolerance sounds noble, but it is self-destructive. Limited tolerance sounds harsh, but it may be the only way to preserve tolerance at all. The paradox forces us to live in this uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, to defend openness, we must close the door on those who would destroy it. In the end, the paradox of tolerance is not a call to abandon tolerance, but a call to deepen our understanding of it. It reminds us that tolerance is not about accepting everything blindly, but about protecting the conditions that make freedom possible. Without boundaries, tolerance collapses. With wise boundaries, it can endure. And so, the paradox challenges us to ask not, should we tolerate everything, but how can we tolerate wisely so that tolerance itself survives? The Bootstrap Paradox. The Bootstrap Paradox is one of the most puzzling and fascinating riddles of time, causality, and existence itself. It arises when something is brought into existence through time travel, but the origin of that thing cannot be traced because it exists in a closed loop. In other words, an object, an idea, or even a person exists without ever truly being created. It simply exists because it always existed. At first, this sounds like clever science fiction, but when you look deeper, it raises unsettling questions about the very nature of time, creation, and reality itself. To see the paradox, imagine this. A scientist builds a time machine and travels to the future. There, she finds a book that explains how to build the machine in great detail. She brings the book back to her own time and uses it to construct the time machine. But here's the problem. Who wrote the book? If she only had it because she brought it back from the future, then its knowledge has no origin. The book was never truly written. It exists in a loop, passed from future to past endlessly. That is the Bootstrap Paradox. Something existing without creation, sustained by a circular chain of cause and effect with no beginning. This paradox becomes even stranger when applied to ideas. Imagine a musician who learns a beautiful song from their older self who traveled back in time. Years later, that same musician becomes older and travels back to teach the same song to their younger self. Who wrote the song? If it exists only because it was passed between versions of the same person, then it never had an original creator. The paradox makes us wonder whether originality itself can exist in a universe with time travel. Could we be living inside loops of knowledge and ideas without realizing it? The paradox also forces us to rethink causality, the principle that every effect must have a... On a psychological level, the Bootstrap Paradox also mirrors the human experience of knowledge and culture. Many ideas we hold dear seem timeless, passed from one generation to the next until their origins are forgotten. Who first told a certain myth? Who first invented a ritual or tradition? Sometimes these things feel as though they simply appeared, circulating endlessly in human history. The paradox reminds us that origins are not always clear, and that sometimes existence feels like a loop we are caught inside. What makes the Bootstrap Paradox so haunting is its challenge to logic. Our minds crave beginnings, explanations, and origins. We want to know where things come from, how they started, who made them, but the paradox shrugs at this demand and presents us with a circle instead of a line. It whispers that maybe not everything has an origin. Maybe not everything needs one. And maybe our very sense of cause and effect is only a small piece of a universe far more mysterious than we can comprehend. In the end, the Bootstrap Paradox is not just about time machines or science fiction. It is about the limits of human understanding. It reminds us that reality may not always follow the neat rules we expect. It pushes us to imagine a world where beginnings and endings blur, where cause and effect fold back on themselves, and where existence can be self-contained. Whether it is a book, a song, an idea, or the universe itself, the Bootstrap Paradox asks us to confront a truth we are rarely prepared for. Sometimes things may exist not because they were created, but because they simply are. The paradox of control. The paradox of control is one of the most profound truths hidden in human psychology. The more desperately we try to control life, people, or outcomes, the less control we actually seem to have. At first, control feels like safety. We plan, organize, discipline, and structure our lives because we believe it will protect us from chaos, uncertainty, and failure. We believe that by tightening our grip, we will finally achieve stability and peace. Yet the paradox reveals the opposite. The tighter we cling, the more anxious we become, and the more life slips through our fingers. True control often comes not from grasping harder, but from learning when to let go. This paradox is most visible in personal life. Think about relationships. When someone tries to control every word, every action, every moment of their partner, it often destroys the very bond they are trying to protect. Love thrives in trust and freedom, but when fear drives us to control, love suffocates. Parents who over-control their children often discover that instead of protecting them, they create rebellion, resentment, or dependence. Friends who try to control one another find the friendship turning cold. The paradox here is clear. By trying to hold on too tightly, we push people further away. The same truth plays out in our pursuit of success. Many people believe that if they can control every detail of their work, their career, or their goals, they will finally feel secure. They micromanage, obsess, and overthink, believing control equals achievement. But in reality, over-control often leads to burnout, stress, and paralysis. The more we try to control every variable, the more overwhelmed we become by the variables we cannot control. Success often flows not from total control, but from flexibility, creativity, and the ability to adapt when things don't go as planned. The paradox also shows up in spiritual traditions across the world. Many philosophies teach that clinging creates suffering, and that true peace comes from letting go. In Buddhism, the idea of non-attachment reflects this paradox. The less we try to control outcomes, the freer and happier we become. In Stoicism, the teaching is to distinguish between what we can control and what we cannot, and to accept the latter with grace. Even in modern psychology, therapies often emphasize acceptance, stop fighting reality, and instead learn to work with it. The paradox echoes across centuries. The more you surrender control, the more you actually gain it. But surrender does not mean passivity. The paradox of control is not telling us to stop making choices or abandon responsibility. Instead, it asks us to recognize the limits of our power. We control our effort, our perspective, and our attitude, but we cannot control outcomes, other people, or the universe. By focusing on what we can control and releasing what we cannot, we paradoxically gain a greater sense of peace, stability, and even influence. Those who cling tightly become rigid and fragile. Those who let go become adaptable and resilient. In the end, the paradox of control teaches one of life's most difficult lessons, that freedom and peace come not from holding on, but from knowing when to release. The more you try to dominate life, the more it dominates you. The more you fight uncertainty, the more it overwhelms you. But when you accept uncertainty, when you trust the flow of life, when you loosen your grip, you discover that you are not powerless at all. You are, paradoxically, more in control than ever, not because you command life, but because you have learned how to live with it.
The paradox of choice. The paradox of choice is one of the most surprising and counterintuitive truths about modern life. The more options we have, the less satisfied we often feel. At first, choice seems like pure freedom. To choose means to be in control of your destiny, to shape your life according to your desires. More options, we think, must mean more happiness, because we can pick the one that suits us best. But the paradox reveals the opposite. An overabundance of choice often leads to confusion, anxiety, regret, and dissatisfaction. What we thought would liberate us can instead become a heavy burden. To see how this paradox works, think of something as simple as shopping. In a store with 2 types of jam, the choice is easy, but in a supermarket with 50 kinds, suddenly the decision feels overwhelming. You worry about picking the wrong one, about missing out on something better. Even after choosing, you wonder if another option would have tasted better. The abundance of choice, instead of bringing joy, creates doubt and dissatisfaction. This small example reflects a much larger truth about life. When faced with too many paths, too many opportunities, too many possible futures, the weight of choice can become paralyzing. Psychologists call this decision paralysis. When confronted with too many options, we often freeze, unable to choose at all, or we make a choice but feel haunted by regret, imagining all the alternatives we didn't take. The paradox deepens. The freedom of choice, when excessive, becomes a kind of prison. Instead of feeling empowered, we feel trapped by possibilities, second-guessing ourselves endlessly. The paradox of choice also reflects a deeper truth about human desire. We believe that more options will satisfy us, but human happiness does not grow endlessly with options. In fact, the more choices we have, the higher our expectations rise. We believe that with so many possibilities, we should be able to find the perfect one. But perfection rarely exists, and so we end up disappointed even when we choose something good. The paradox is cruel. The more freedom we have, the more we expect from it, and the harder it becomes to be satisfied. This paradox is especially visible in modern society. In the past, life offered fewer paths. People followed traditions, inherited roles, or clear expectations. There was less freedom, but also less anxiety. Today we are told we can be anything, pursue any career, live anywhere, create any life we want. This freedom is extraordinary, but it also creates pressure. With so many possible lives, how do we know we've chosen the right one? Every decision about education, career, love, lifestyle becomes heavy with the fear of missing out on better options. The paradox of choice is no longer just about picking jam or clothes. It's about constructing an identity in a world of endless possibilities. On a personal level, the paradox shapes our relationships. Dating apps offer thousands of potential partners, giving us more choice than any generation before. But instead of creating satisfaction, this abundance often creates restlessness. People swipe endlessly, always wondering if someone better is just one more swipe away. Relationships become harder to sustain when choice feels infinite. The paradox reminds us that commitment requires limits, and that freedom without boundaries can destroy the very happiness we seek. Philosophically, the paradox of choice raises questions about what freedom really is. Is freedom having every possible option? Or is freedom the ability to choose meaningfully without being crushed by endless alternatives? Perhaps true freedom comes not from limitless options, but from clarity of purpose. When we know what we value most, choices become easier, and satisfaction grows. The paradox suggests that happiness is not about maximizing options, but about learning to live deeply with the choices we make. The paradox also invites us to rethink control. We often believe that more choice equals more control over our lives. But the truth is that too much choice often makes us feel powerless, not powerful. Real power comes not from having everything, but from knowing what truly matters and focusing on it. Limiting choice, in this sense, is not a loss of freedom, but a gain in clarity. Ultimately, the paradox of choice teaches a counterintuitive lesson. Less is often more. Too much freedom can become a burden, while limits can create peace. Happiness does not come from exploring every option, but from committing to paths that give life meaning. We cannot live every possible life. We can only live one. The paradox challenges us to embrace that truth, to choose with courage, and to stop looking back. In the end, the paradox of choice reminds us that freedom is not about endless possibilities, but about making choices that align with our deepest values. When we stop chasing the illusion of perfection, we begin to appreciate the beauty of imperfection. When we stop fearing what we didn't choose, we begin to cherish what we did. And in that acceptance, we discover that true freedom is not found in having everything, but in loving the life we create from the choices we make. The paradox of self-sacrifice. The paradox of self-sacrifice explores one of the deepest contradictions in human existence. Sometimes, by giving up your own life, comfort, or well-being, you create meaning and value far greater than if you had held on to them. At first, self-sacrifice seems like loss, a surrender of something vital. To give up your time, your resources, or even your very life for someone else sounds like the ultimate form of weakness. Yet paradoxically, acts of self-sacrifice often reveal the greatest strength, and they can leave behind legacies that outlive the individual who gave them. The paradox forces us to ask, how can giving everything away, even life itself, sometimes be the truest form of gain? We see this paradox most clearly in stories of heroes. A soldier who throws themselves on a grenade to save their comrades dies, but in doing so, they save many lives. A firefighter who runs into a burning building may perish, but their sacrifice may rescue a child who will grow to change the world. In each case, what seems like a loss on the surface becomes a profound act of creation, giving life, hope, or freedom to others. The paradox is striking. By surrendering their own survival, they create survival for others, and in doing so, they achieve a kind of immortality through memory, honor, and impact. The paradox also stretches beyond the battlefield. Parents who sacrifice their dreams, time, or comfort to raise children often find deeper meaning in their children's lives than they ever could have found in pursuing their own desires alone. Teachers, doctors, activists, and countless ordinary people sacrifice wealth, fame, or ease to serve others, and in doing so, they discover a fulfillment that comfort alone could never provide. The paradox here is that selfishness, which seems like the path to happiness, often leads to emptiness, while sacrifice, which seems like the path to suffering, often leads to the deepest form of joy. On a philosophical level, the paradox of self-sacrifice forces us to question the very definition of value. If life's ultimate goal is survival, then self-sacrifice makes no sense. But if life's ultimate goal is meaning, then self-sacrifice may be the highest expression of that meaning. Many religions and philosophies point to sacrifice as the core of human greatness. In Christianity, the sacrifice of Jesus is seen as the ultimate act of love. In Buddhism, monks renounce worldly pleasures to seek enlightenment for the benefit of all. In countless mythologies, heroes descend into danger, not for themselves, but for others. Across cultures, sacrifice is honored not as foolishness, but as the mark of transcendence. The paradox grows deeper when we consider identity. In a way, self-sacrifice allows us to live beyond ourselves. When someone sacrifices for others, their influence ripples outward, shaping lives long after they are gone. A mother who sacrifices for her children lives on in their achievements. A martyr who dies for justice lives on in the cause they inspire. The paradox is that in ending one life, self-sacrifice often multiplies life, carrying the essence of the sacrifice far beyond the boundaries of one person. In giving up the self, one becomes larger than the self. Yet the paradox also carries a warning. Not all sacrifice is noble. Some people give up themselves out of guilt, coercion, or manipulation, and in doing so, they lose not only their freedom, but also their meaning. True self-sacrifice comes not from weakness, but from strength, from choosing to give, not being forced to. The paradox reminds us that while sacrifice can be the highest form of love, it must be chosen with wisdom. To give everything blindly can destroy both giver and receiver. To give with intention can transform lives. The paradox also appears in everyday life in small ways. You give up your evening to comfort a friend. You sacrifice your comfort to care for a sick loved one. You let go of your own plans to help someone in need. These moments may feel small, but they build bonds of trust, love, and community. They remind us that life's greatest treasures are rarely found in what we keep, but in what we give away. The paradox whispers that sacrifice, far from weakening us, strengthens the invisible fabric that binds people together. Ultimately, the paradox of self-sacrifice reveals a profound truth. Sometimes the path to true fulfillment lies not in taking more for ourselves, but in giving more to others. By sacrificing, we may lose comfort, wealth, or even life itself. But we gain something far greater: meaning, love, and a legacy that endures beyond time. In a world obsessed with survival and self-interest, the paradox challenges us to see that perhaps the highest form of living is found in the willingness to give life away. The Sorites Paradox, often called the paradox of the heap, is one of the most deceptively simple yet profoundly unsettling paradoxes in philosophy. It begins with an ordinary question: how many grains of sand does it take to make a heap? If you have just 1 grain of sand, no one would call that a heap. 2 grains, still not a heap. 10, still too few. But at some point, the number of grains becomes large enough that we suddenly declare, now it is a heap. Yet here lies the paradox. If you cannot say exactly where the line is drawn, then how can a heap exist at all? If removing 1 grain does not stop it from being a heap, then you could keep removing grains one by one, and by that logic, even a single grain should still be called a heap. The paradox exposes the vagueness of our language and the uncertainty of boundaries in the world we live in. At first glance, the Sorites Paradox seems trivial, a puzzle about piles of sand. But it carries a much deeper implication. Our categories, definitions, and even our moral judgments often rest on vague boundaries. When does childhood end and adulthood begin? Is it at 18 years old, 21, or some other arbitrary number? When does a person become old? At 60, 70, 90? There is no exact grain of time where youth ends and old age begins. Yet we talk about these stages of life as if they are clear and certain. The paradox forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that many of the categories we live by are built on blurry lines. The Sorites Paradox also challenges our sense of identity. Consider the body. Every day we lose cells, grow new ones, and change in subtle ways. Over years, nearly every cell in our body is replaced. At what point are we still the same person? If you remove one cell, you are still you. If you remove thousands, you are still you. But if every part is replaced over time, then who exactly are you? The paradox suggests that identity, like a heap of sand, may not rest on precise boundaries, but on continuity, perception, and agreement. This paradox also raises questions about morality. Imagine laws against stealing, which often hinge on value. If taking $1 is not considered a serious crime, but taking $10,000 is, then where is the exact boundary between minor theft and major theft? If each additional dollar stolen seems like a small step, when exactly does the act cross the line into something severe? The Sorites Paradox forces us to admit that many of our moral and legal categories are not fixed truths, but social agreements built on vagueness. Philosophers have wrestled with this paradox for centuries. Some argue that the problem comes from the vagueness of language. Words like heap, tall, or bald are inherently fuzzy, so they cannot be tied to precise boundaries. Others suggest that reality itself is not neatly divided into categories, and our attempt to force precision onto a messy world creates the paradox. Perhaps there is no exact moment when a heap appears, or when a person becomes old, or when a child becomes an adult. Perhaps the world is continuous, and our need for clear divisions is just a tool we invented to navigate it. The Sorites Paradox also touches psychology. Human beings are uncomfortable with uncertainty, so we crave clear lines. We want to know where things begin and end, where categories shift, where rules apply. But the paradox reminds us that clarity is often an illusion. Life rarely gives us sharp boundaries. Instead, it offers gradual transitions, blurred lines, and gray areas. The paradox forces us to confront the truth that much of reality exists not in absolutes, but in spectrums. On a deeper, existential level, the Sorites Paradox whispers something haunting about time and death. If removing one grain of sand does not stop a heap from being a heap, then when does life stop being life? Each moment we age, each breath we take, we move closer to death. But when exactly does the line cross? Is there a single instant where life ends, or is it another gray area? The paradox challenges us to reflect on the continuity of existence, the gradual process of change, and the difficulty of drawing clear boundaries around life's most profound mysteries. Ultimately, the Sorites Paradox teaches humility. It reminds us that our language, categories, and systems are tools, not perfect reflections of reality. The world is complex, fluid, and resistant to the neat boxes we try to place it in. A heap is not about the exact number of grains, but about perspective and agreement. Adulthood is not a single birthday, but a gradual transformation. Identity is not fixed in one cell or one moment, but in the continuity of experience. In the end, the Sorites Paradox reveals that life is filled with blurred lines, and that is not a flaw, but a truth. It shows us that certainty is often an illusion, and wisdom lies not in forcing rigid definitions, but in learning to live gracefully with ambiguity. Just as a heap of sand cannot be reduced to one exact number, much of life cannot be reduced to one exact answer. The paradox does not just confuse us, it liberates us by reminding us that beauty often exists in the spaces between clarity and mystery. The Ship of Theseus Paradox. The Ship of Theseus Paradox is one of the most famous and enduring thought experiments in philosophy. It asks a question that seems simple, but shakes the foundations of how we think about identity, change, and continuity. If every single part of an object is replaced over time, is it still the same object? The paradox is usually explained with the story of Theseus's ship. According to legend, the ship was preserved as a monument after his heroic voyages, but as time passed, its wooden planks began to rot, and one by one they were replaced with new ones. Eventually, every single plank, mast, and piece of rope had been replaced. The question then arises, is this ship, now made of entirely new parts, still the ship of Theseus? The paradox grows more complicated when we add a twist. Suppose someone collected all the old discarded planks and rebuilt the original ship. Now there are two ships, one made of all the new parts and one made of all the original ones. Which is the real ship of Theseus? Is it the one that carries the continuity of history and function, or the one made of the original material? The paradox forces us to confront the uneasy truth that identity is not as simple as it seems. This puzzle does not only apply to ships, it applies to us. Human beings are living versions of the ship of Theseus. Over the years, the cells in our bodies die and are replaced. Scientists estimate that within a decade or so, nearly every cell in your body will have been replaced with a new one. If this is true, then the you that existed 10 years ago is physically gone. Yet we still believe we are the same person. What makes us the same? Is it our memory, our consciousness, our continuity of experience? Or is it just an illusion that hides the truth that we are constantly becoming someone new? The ship of Theseus paradox brings us face to face with the mystery of identity. The paradox also applies to objects and culture. Think of a family heirloom, like a chair, passed down for generations. If parts of it are repaired and replaced over the years, is it still the same chair? Or think of cities. Buildings are demolished, rebuilt, and transformed, yet we still call the city by the same name. Is New York today the same city it was 200 years ago? The paradox suggests that identity may not lie in materials, but in continuity, function, and meaning. Philosophically, the ship of Theseus paradox exposes the tension between two ways of defining identity, material continuity and functional continuity. If identity is based on material, then once the parts change, the identity is lost. But if identity is based on function, history, and continuity, then the identity remains even as the materials change. Both answers feel true, yet both also feel incomplete. This is why the paradox has fascinated philosophers for centuries. It resists resolution, forcing us to accept that identity may be more complex than any simple definition. The paradox also connects to morality and responsibility. If you change entirely over time, are you still responsible for the actions of your past self? If the person you were 10 years ago is gone in every physical sense, should you still carry their guilt, shame, or debts? The law assumes yes, that continuity of identity is enough. But the paradox suggests a deeper mystery. Perhaps we are both the same and not the same as who we were before. On a spiritual level, the ship of Theseus paradox resonates with questions of the soul. If the body changes constantly, then what is it that remains the same? Many traditions answer that it is the soul, the consciousness, or some essence beyond the material. Others argue that there is no unchanging essence at all, that identity is just a story we tell ourselves to give life coherence. The paradox does not solve the question, but it sharpens it. What exactly is the self that we cling to? The paradox even reaches into modern science and technology. Consider artificial intelligence, or the idea of uploading a human mind into a machine. If your consciousness could be copied and placed into a new body or a digital form, would that still be you? Or would it be just a copy, while the original you is lost? Just like the ship, the boundaries of identity blur when parts, whether planks, cells, or memories, are replaced. Ultimately, the ship of Theseus paradox teaches us something profound about life. Identity is not fixed, but fluid. We are always changing, always becoming, and yet we carry a thread of continuity that gives us a sense of self. Perhaps the paradox is not meant to be solved, but embraced. The ship of Theseus is both the same ship and not the same ship, just as we are both the same person, being not the same person we once were. In the end, the paradox reminds us that change does not erase identity, it defines it. A ship, a city, a person is not just a collection of parts, but a living story, a journey through time. And like Theseus's ship, we too are rebuilt every day, yet somehow remain ourselves. The paradox does not weaken our sense of identity, it deepens it, showing that being human is not about being fixed, but about being continuous in the midst of constant change. The Hedonistic Paradox. The Hedonistic Paradox, also known as the paradox of pleasure, reveals a strange contradiction in the way human beings experience joy. At first glance, it seems obvious that the surest way to be happy is to pursue pleasure directly, to chase after comfort, enjoyment, and all the things that bring delight. But here lies the paradox. The more you deliberately seek pleasure as your ultimate goal, the harder it becomes to actually achieve lasting happiness. Pleasure, when pursued for its own sake, often vanishes, leaving behind emptiness or even pain. This paradox plays out clearly in everyday life. Imagine someone who devotes all their energy to having fun, eating delicious food, indulging in entertainment, pursuing wealth, or surrounding themselves with luxury. For a short time, they may feel satisfied, but soon the excitement fades, and they must chase the next thrill and then the next. The more they demand happiness, the more fragile and fleeting it becomes. Instead of feeling fulfilled, they find themselves trapped on what psychologists call the hedonic treadmill, where no amount of pleasure ever seems enough. The paradox emerges. The harder you try to capture happiness, the faster it slips away. The hedonistic paradox also reveals itself in relationships. When people enter love purely to satisfy their own desire for happiness, they often end up disappointed. If you love someone because of what they give you, attention, affection, validation, then the relationship becomes fragile. The moment those things fade, so does your sense of joy. But when love is pursued not as a way to get happiness, but as a way to give, to grow, and to build something greater than yourself, happiness often arises as a natural byproduct. The paradox whispers this truth. The deepest pleasures often come when we stop chasing them directly. On a deeper philosophy's cow level, the paradox challenges our understanding of happiness itself. If happiness is merely the pursuit of pleasure, then why does it so often fail us? Perhaps because happiness is not just about feeling good, it is about living well. True joy comes not from chasing sensation, but from pursuing meaning, purpose, and connection. Ironically, when we aim at pleasure, we often miss it. But when we aim at meaning, purpose, or love, pleasure arrives unexpectedly, as a companion. The paradox reveals that happiness is not a goal to be hunted, but a side effect of living deeply and authentically. The paradox can also be seen in creative work. Artists, writers, and musicians who obsessively try to create something that will bring them joy often find themselves stuck in frustration. But when they immerse themselves in the process, forgetting about happiness and focusing on expression, creation, or truth, they often discover joy along the way. This is why some of life's most satisfying pleasures arrive when we are not thinking about pleasure at all, but when we are lost in flow, in work, in art, in love, or in service. Psychology echoes this paradox through the concept of pursuit versus presence. When we are constantly focused on chasing happiness in the future, we are rarely present in the moment. But when we are fully present, when we are not obsessing about whether we are happy but simply living in the now, we often discover happiness naturally. The paradox shows us that joy is not something you can grab, it is something you must allow. The hedonistic paradox also carries a moral dimension. A life devoted only to personal pleasure often becomes shallow and lonely. Those who live only for themselves may find their joys growing smaller because true fulfillment often comes from connection with others, from giving, sharing, and building something beyond the self. The paradox suggests that selfish pleasure leads to emptiness, while selflessness often leads to joy. The more we focus on making ourselves happy, the less happy we become. The more we focus on making others happy, the more happiness we discover for ourselves. On a spiritual level, the paradox echoes teachings found in many traditions. Buddhism teaches that clinging to desire creates suffering. Stoicism teaches that pleasure pursued directly enslaves us, but freedom from desire brings peace. Even modern wisdom reminds us that happiness cannot be forced. It must be found by living in alignment with values greater than ourselves. Across cultures, the lesson is the same. Chase happiness and you lose it. Live fully and it arrives uninvited. Ultimately, the hedonistic paradox teaches a profound lesson about human nature. Pleasure is not a destination to be reached, but a shadow that follows us when we walk toward meaning. To live chasing happiness is to live in constant dissatisfaction, because happiness is not meant to be grasped. It is meant to be experienced as a byproduct of a life well lived. In the end, the paradox reveals this truth. Happiness is not found by asking, "How can I be happy?" but by asking, "What is worth living for?" When we devote ourselves to love, creativity, growth, and purpose, happiness comes quietly, like sunlight through a window. and the more we forget about pursuing it directly, the more it shines. The paradox of effort. The paradox of effort is one of the most fascinating contradictions in human psychology and personal growth. Sometimes, the harder you try to achieve something, the further away it seems to slip. At first, effort feels like the key to success. Work harder, push more, fight longer, and eventually, victory will come. And often this is true. Without effort, little can be accomplished. Yet, there are areas of life where effort becomes the very obstacle that blocks progress. The paradox reveals that in certain pursuits, whether it is happiness, relaxation, creativity, or even love, striving too hard produces the opposite of what we want. Consider the simplest example: sleep. Everyone has experienced lying awake at night, desperately trying to force themselves to sleep. The more you focus, the harder it becomes. You count sheep, control your breathing, squeeze your eyes shut, and yet you remain wide awake. The paradox is clear. Sleep is something that comes when you let go, not when you force it. The same applies to relaxation. If you sit down determined to relax as an achievement, the very act of trying often creates tension. True relaxation only happens when you stop demanding it. The paradox shows us that effort can sometimes destroy the very outcome it seeks to create. This paradox also arises in creativity. Many writers, artists, and thinkers know the frustration of creative block. The harder they strain to come up with an idea, the emptier their minds feel. Yet when they step away, take a walk, or let their minds wander, inspiration often arrives uninvited. Creativity, like sleep, resists force. It blossoms in openness, not pressure. The paradox teaches us that not all goals can be conquered by sheer force of will. Some require surrender, patience, and trust in the process. The paradox of effort also plays out in love and human connection. The more someone desperately tries to win another's affection, the less attractive they often appear. Desperation creates tension, pressure, and neediness, all of which repel rather than attract. True love, like true friendship, flows more naturally when it is not forced. When people are authentic, present, and unafraid of rejection, they often draw others in more powerfully than when they are trying too hard. The paradox whispers a painful truth. Trying too hard to be loved often prevents us from being loved at all. On a deeper level, the paradox challenges our cultural obsession with effort. We are taught from childhood that hard work solves everything, that effort equals virtue, and that rest is weakness. But life is not always a battlefield to be conquered. Some things are achieved not by pushing, but by yielding. Eastern philosophies such as Taoism capture this beautifully in the concept of Wu Wei, effortless action, or the art of flowing with the current rather than fighting it. The paradox of effort teaches us that sometimes, the harder you push against the river, the more exhausted you become, while those who flow with it reach their destination with grace. The paradox also shapes our pursuit of happiness. People often believe that if they try hard enough, they can force themselves to be happy. They fill their days with goals, achievements, and pleasures. But happiness remains elusive. Why? Because happiness is not something that can be taken by force. It is something that emerges naturally when we live in alignment with our values, relationships, and purpose. The paradox shows us that happiness comes not as the result of demanding it, but as the byproduct of living fully. Psychologically, the paradox of effort highlights the role of tension. When we strain too hard, we create inner resistance. The mind becomes tight, the body becomes rigid, and the natural flow of experience is blocked. But when we release, when we allow instead of force, the very thing we sought often arises. It is like holding water in your hands. The tighter you squeeze, the more it slips away. The gentler you hold, the more it remains. This paradox even applies to personal growth. Many people want to become better versions of themselves. They push relentlessly, demanding discipline, perfection, and improvement. Yet often, this only breeds frustration and self-criticism. Growth, like happiness or creativity, requires effort, but it also requires acceptance. Real transformation comes when we balance striving with compassion, discipline with patience. The paradox teaches that effort without acceptance becomes self-destruction, but effort with acceptance becomes evolution. Ultimately, the paradox of effort reveals that life requires both strength and softness. There are times to push with all your might and times to release with trust. Knowing the difference is wisdom. Effort is essential for survival and achievement, but when applied blindly, it becomes a cage. The paradox reminds us that sometimes letting go is not weakness, it is the highest form of strength. In the end, the paradox of effort teaches us that success in life is not always about how hard we try, but about how wisely we try. It reminds us that effort must be balanced with surrender, striving with stillness, and control with trust. Only then do we discover the strange, beautiful truth. Often, by easing our grip, we gain what we were chasing all along.
The Banach-Tarski Paradox. The Banach-Tarski Paradox is one of the most astonishing and counterintuitive results in the world of mathematics. At its core, it claims something that seems not only impossible but absurd. You can take a solid ball, divide it into a finite number of pieces, and then reassemble those pieces, without stretching, shrinking, or adding anything, into two balls identical to the original. In other words, you can create two balls out of one, each the same size as the first. This result appears to defy everything we know about volume, matter, and even reality itself. How can something be duplicated without adding anything new? How can mathematics suggest a kind of infinite magic inside ordinary objects? That is the heart of the paradox. To understand it, we must look closer at what the paradox really means. The Banach-Tarski result is not about physically cutting a ball with a knife, but about cutting it mathematically, into sets so strange and fragmented that they cannot exist in the physical world. These pieces are not like slices of a cake, neat and visible. Instead, they are infinitely scattered points, broken apart in a way that defies our intuition. Because of the rules of infinite sets and group theory, these bizarre pieces can be rearranged into not one but two identical copies of the original ball. The paradox is not about physical matter, but about the strange and unsettling consequences of pure logic and infinity. The paradox challenges our understanding of measure, volume, and reality. In the physical world, volume is conserved. If you cut a loaf of bread in half, the total bread remains the same. You cannot magically double it. But in the abstract world of mathematics, where infinity can be manipulated, the rules are not so strict. The Banach-Tarski Paradox shows that when infinite sets are involved, our ordinary intuitions about ES. The paradox also challenges our notions of limits and possibility. If logic allows something so wild, what else might be possible that we have not yet imagined? It reminds us that reality is not always bound by human intuition. The world is stranger than we think, and infinity even stranger still. By showing us the impossible, the Banach-Tarski Paradox opens our minds to the idea that the boundaries of knowledge are always wider than they appear. Critics sometimes argue that this paradox is meaningless because it cannot be performed physically. True, you cannot cut a physical ball into Banach-Tarski pieces. Atoms, molecules, and quantum laws do not allow it. But its value lies in its challenge. It shows us that the rules of the finite world break down when confronted with infinity. It reveals that mathematics is not limited to what we can see or touch. It extends into realms beyond imagination, where truth is stranger than fiction. Ultimately, the Banach-Tarski Paradox is less about duplicating balls and more about duplicating thought. It demonstrates how far logic can stretch, how infinity reshapes reality, and how our sense of the possible is often far too narrow. It is a reminder that knowledge does not always make us comfortable. Sometimes it unsettles us, forcing us to expand our minds. In the end, the paradox leaves us with awe. A single ball becomes two, a single truth becomes many, and the infinite reveals itself as both terrifying and beautiful. The Banach-Tarski Paradox whispers that the universe, whether mathematical or physical, is not a simple place of neat answers, but a place of wonder where even the impossible might, in some sense, be true. Zeno's Paradox is one of the oldest and most mind-bending collections of puzzles in philosophy, dating back nearly 2,500 years, yet it continues to provoke wonder even today. At its core, Zeno's Paradox challenges our most basic assumption about reality. That motion is possible. We walk, we run, we throw objects, and we watch the stars move across the night sky. Movement feels obvious, undeniable, and constant. Yet Zeno, a philosopher from ancient Greece, argued that motion is logically impossible. Through clever reasoning, he presented paradoxes that trap us in contradictions, leaving us to question whether movement is real or merely an illusion. One of Zeno's most famous paradoxes is the dichotomy paradox. It begins with something simple. Before you can walk across a room, you must first travel half the distance. But before you reach halfway, you must travel a quarter of the distance. Before a quarter, an eighth, and so on. The sequence never ends. Since you must complete an infinite number of steps to cross the room, how can you ever arrive at your destination? The paradox suggests that motion requires completing an infinite series of tasks, which should be impossible in a finite amount of time. And yet, every day, we cross rooms without difficulty. Another famous version is Achilles and the tortoise. Achilles, the great Greek warrior, is racing a tortoise. To be generous, he gives the tortoise a head start. Now, Achilles is much faster, so he quickly reaches the point where the tortoise began. But in that time, the tortoise has moved a little further ahead. When Achilles reaches that new point, the tortoise has moved forward again. No matter how fast Achilles runs, the tortoise always remains just slightly ahead. Logic insists that Achilles can never catch up, even though in real life we know he easily would. Zeno also proposed the arrow paradox. Yet even with calculus, Zeno's paradoxes are not fully tamed. They continue to haunt philosophy and physics. Modern science asks whether space and time are continuous or made of indivisible units. If time is infinitely divisible, Zeno's paradoxes resurface. If time is made of discrete moments like frames in a film, new paradoxes emerge. At the deepest levels of quantum physics, motion itself becomes uncertain, described not by smooth lines, but by probabilities. Zeno's questions remain alive in every attempt to understand the fabric of the universe. On a psychological level, Zeno's paradox can be seen as a metaphor for human experience. We often feel stuck in endless steps, unable to reach our goals. Each milestone achieved reveals another still ahead. Success, like Achilles chasing the tortoise, always seems just out of reach. Life can feel like an infinite series of tasks that never add up to completion. Zeno's paradoxes, in this sense, echo our struggles with progress, patience, and the pursuit of meaning. Philosophically, Zeno invites us to embrace humility. What seems obvious, that motion exists, can unravel when examined with reason. The paradox teaches that the world is stranger and more complex than our senses or logic alone can capture. It reminds us that mystery lies beneath even the most ordinary experiences, like walking across a room or watching an arrow fly. Ultimately, Zeno's paradox is not meant to convince us that motion is impossible, but to remind us that reality cannot be taken for granted. Motion, time, and infinity are not simple. They are profound mysteries, woven into existence itself. Zeno forces us to confront the possibility that the truths of the universe may forever dance just beyond the reach of our certainty. In the end, the paradox leaves us with wonder. Whether or not Zeno's reasoning proves anything final, his puzzles still reveal the Barber Paradox. The Barber Paradox is a classic logical puzzle that appears simple on the surface but quickly spirals into contradiction, leaving us trapped in an impossible loop. It goes like this. Imagine a barber in a small town who shaves all the men who do not shave themselves, and only those men. The question is, who shaves the barber? If the barber shaves himself, then he belongs to the group of men who shave themselves, which means he should not be shaved by the barber. But if the barber does not shave himself, then he belongs to the group of men who do not shave themselves, and therefore the barber must shave him. Either way, contradiction emerges. The barber cannot shave himself, and he cannot avoid shaving himself. The paradox exposes a deep flaw in the way we construct rules, categories, and self-reference. At first glance, the Barber Paradox feels like a joke, a quirky word game built to amuse. But beneath the humor lies a serious challenge to logic. This puzzle, formulated by the logician Bertrand Russell in the early 20th century, illustrates what is now known as Russell's paradox. It demonstrates that certain kinds of self-referential definitions, rules that include themselves within their own scope, collapse under contradiction. In the case of the barber, the definition of who he shaves creates a logical loop with no escape. This paradox is not just about barbers. It is about the foundations of logic and mathematics. Russell originally used a version of this paradox to challenge set theory, the mathematical system that organizes objects into groups or sets. For example, you might have the set of all cats or the set of all books in a library. But Russell asked, what about the set of all sets that do not contain themselves? Does this set contain itself? If it does, then by definition it should not contain itself. But if it does not, then it must. The paradox also carries symbolic meaning for human life. Consider identity. We often try to define ourselves by our own definitions, creating self-referential loops that lead to confusion. Who am I? If I define myself entirely by my thoughts, then who is the I doing the thinking? If I define myself by my roles, like student, worker, or parent, then who am I when those roles change? Like the barber, the attempt to include ourselves in our own definitions often leads to paradox. Identity, like logic, resists closure. Another way the Barber Paradox resonates is in social systems. Rules and laws often collapse when they try to regulate themselves. Who enforces the law on the enforcers? Who governs the governors? Who watches the watchers? Just as the barber cannot shave himself without contradiction, systems of power struggle when they try to apply their rules inward. The paradox highlights the eternal challenge of accountability. No rule can fully include itself without creating a gap or a contradiction. Psychologically, the Barber Paradox mirrors the loops of self-awareness. Human beings are capable of thinking about themselves, of being aware of their own awareness, but this reflexive capacity often creates confusion and anxiety. When we think about ourselves thinking, we spiral into endless loops. Am I authentic or just playing a role? Am I really happy or just convincing myself I am? Like the barber, the mind struggles when it tries to turn its tools entirely inward. In the world of science and logic, Russell's discovery pushed mathematicians to rebuild the foundations of set theory, introducing stricter rules to avoid such paradoxes. Yet even today, self-referential paradoxes remain central to logic, philosophy, and computer science. They remind us that every system has limits, every rule has boundaries, and total self-containment may always be impossible. Ultim. The paradox of learning. The paradox of learning reveals a strange and beautiful contradiction about knowledge. The more we learn, the more we realize how little we truly know. At the beginning of our journey, the world of knowledge seems manageable. A child, for example, often feels certain about their understanding of life because their world is small and simple. As we grow and learn more, the boundaries of that world expand. And with every expansion comes the realization that what lies beyond our grasp is infinitely larger than what we already hold. The paradox whispers that learning, rather than giving us certainty, often deepens our sense of mystery. This paradox can be explained through a simple metaphor. Imagine standing in a small circle of light surrounded by darkness. At first, the light only covers a tiny area. The boundary between the light and the darkness is small, but as the circle grows larger, the boundary expands. The more we illuminate, the more darkness we see pressing against us. In the same way, knowledge expands awareness of ignorance. A person who knows little may feel certain and confident, but a person who has studied deeply begins to feel the weight of the unknown. True wisdom often brings humility, not arrogance. We see this paradox everywhere in human history. Early humans believed they understood the world completely. The sun rose, the seasons changed, the earth provided food. But as they studied, questions multiplied. Why do the stars move? What is the sun made of? What lies beyond the horizon? Every answer opened the door to 10 new questions. Modern science continues this same pattern. We know more about the universe now than at any time in history. Yet the more we discover, the more mysteries emerge. We learned about atoms, only to discover subatomic particles, quantum uncertainty, and invisible forces we still cannot fully explain. Philosophically, this paradox forces us to confront the limits of human knowledge. Can we ever truly know everything, or will every discovery only show us how much lies beyond our reach? Socrates, one of the wisest figures of ancient philosophy, summed it up when he said, "I know that I know nothing." This statement was not despair, but wisdom. Socrates recognized that knowledge without humility becomes arrogance, while ignorance with humility becomes the doorway to deeper truth. The paradox of learning also carries a psychological challenge. For some, the awareness of how much we do not know creates anxiety. The vastness of the unknown can feel overwhelming, even meaningless. But for others, it creates wonder, an endless horizon of discovery. The paradox invites us to choose. Will the vastness of what we do not know frighten us or inspire us? Will we cling to false certainty or embrace curiosity? In education, the paradox teaches an important lesson. The goal of learning is not to fill students with facts, but to awaken them to curiosity and humility. A good teacher does not give final answers, but shows how to ask better questions. True learning is not about reaching an end, but about beginning a lifelong journey. The paradox reveals that the joy of knowledge lies not in completion, but in pursuit. Ultimately, the paradox of learning is not a flaw, but a gift. It means that there is always more to discover, always more to explore. It reminds us that the human journey is not toward absolute certainty, but toward deeper questions, richer understanding, and endless curiosity. The paradox assures us that life will never run out of mystery, because every answer leads us deeper into the unknown. In the end, the paradox of learning teaches us that wisdom is not found in knowing everything, but in knowing how vast everything truly is. It invites us to live not with arrogance.
The paradox of wealth. The paradox of wealth is a powerful contradiction that cuts to the core of human desire. The more wealth people accumulate, the less satisfied and secure they often feel. At first glance, this seems completely wrong. Money appears to be the ultimate solution to life's problems. It buys food, shelter, comfort, opportunity, and freedom. People naturally assume that more wealth will always mean more happiness and security. Yet history, psychology, and personal experience reveal the opposite. Beyond a certain point, the pursuit of wealth creates more anxiety, emptiness, and discontent than joy. The paradox asks us to reflect on why something so universally sought can so often leave people unfulfilled. To understand the paradox, we must first acknowledge the truth that money does solve real problems. For someone in poverty, a small increase in wealth can transform life completely. Food on the table, a roof overhead, medical care, education, and dignity. At this level, wealth truly improves happiness because it meets basic needs. But as income rises beyond the threshold of survival and comfort, the effect begins to diminish. A bigger house, a faster car, or a more luxurious vacation may provide pleasure, but the pleasure quickly fades. The paradox reveals that while wealth is powerful in eliminating misery, it is weak in creating lasting fulfillment. This is known as the hedonic treadmill. As people acquire more, their expectations rise. The house that once felt like a dream soon feels ordinary. The possessions that once brought excitement lose their shine. Instead of feeling grateful, people begin to feel restless, chasing the next level of luxury. The paradox of wealth shows us that desire is endless. The more we satisfy it, the more it grows. What begins as a pursuit of security becomes an addiction to comparison, status, and consumption, the par. A dox also exposes how wealth can breed insecurity. Strangely, the more money people acquire, the more fearful they often become of losing it. A poor person may live with little, but they are accustomed to survival without abundance. A wealthy person, however, may constantly fear market crashes, theft, betrayal, or the decline of status. Their life becomes dominated not by joy, but by worry. Wealth, instead of creating peace, creates chains of anxiety. Culturally, the paradox of wealth plays out in societies across the world. As nations become richer, happiness does not always rise. In fact, depression, loneliness, and disconnection often increase in wealthy societies. The paradox suggests that once basic needs are met, wealth does not buy the things humans truly crave, meaning love, belonging, and purpose. These cannot be purchased, no matter how large a bank account grows. Philosophically, the paradox forces us to ask, what is wealth, really? Is it simply the possession of money, or is it the experience of sufficiency? A person with little who feels content may be wealthier in spirit than a millionaire who feels restless. True wealth, some argue, lies not in having more, but in needing less. The paradox reveals that if wealth is measured by desire, then those with endless desire are the poorest of all, no matter how much they own. The paradox also raises moral questions. If wealth beyond comfort does not create happiness, why do so many pursue it at the expense of others, even at the expense of their own peace? The answer lies in comparison. Much of wealth's power comes not from what it provides, but from how it positions us relative to others. People often care less about absolute comfort than about being ahead. This creates competition, envy, and endless striving, where happiness is always just out of reach. Spiritually, the paradox has been recognized for centuries. Religious and philosophical traditions often warn against the dangers of greed and attachment to material wealth. Buddhism teaches that clinging to desire creates suffering. Christianity warns that love of money is the root of many evils. Stoicism reminds us that happiness comes not from external possessions, but from inner freedom. Across cultures, wisdom has long echoed the same truth. Wealth without wisdom destroys, while simplicity with gratitude frees. Yet the paradox does not condemn wealth entirely. It reminds us instead to use wealth wisely. Money, when seen as a tool rather than an idol, can create opportunities, reduce suffering, and empower generosity. A wealthy person who uses their resources to help others, to create beauty, or to support meaningful causes often finds joy that endless self-indulgence cannot bring. The paradox teaches us that wealth becomes fulfilling only when it is directed outward, not hoarded inward. Ultimately, the paradox of wealth reveals a deep truth about the human condition. What we seek most, happiness, meaning, peace, cannot be bought, only lived. Wealth may provide comfort, but comfort without purpose becomes emptiness. Money may offer security, but security without love becomes loneliness. The paradox shows us that the richest life is not always the one with the most possessions, but the one with the deepest gratitude, the clearest values, and the strongest connections. In the end, the paradox of wealth is not meant to make us reject money, but to remind us not to worship it. Wealth is powerful, but it is not ultimate. The truest wealth lies in learning to see enough, to live with purpose, and to give generously. The paradox teaches us that the richest person is not the one who has the most, but the one who needs the least. And in that wisdom lies freedom. The observer effect. The observer effect is one of the most intriguing paradoxes of both science and philosophy. At its core, it reveals that the very act of observation can change the thing being observed. This idea feels counterintuitive. Shouldn't reality exist independently of whether or not we look at it? A rock remains a rock, whether or not someone is watching. A tree grows in the forest even if no one sees it. Yet, in certain contexts, especially in physics, psychology, and human behavior, the presence of an observer alters the outcome. The paradox arises when we realize that reality, in some situations, cannot be separated from the act of perception itself. In science, the observer effect is most famously illustrated in quantum mechanics. Particles like electrons and photons behave in strange ways depending on whether they are being measured. In the famous double-slit experiment, light passing through two slits creates an interference pattern, behaving like a wave. But when scientists observe the particles, the pattern collapses, and the particles behave like solid points. The simple act of measurement changes the outcome. This suggests that at the most fundamental level of reality, observation does not just reveal the truth, it shapes it. The paradox challenges our basic assumption that the universe exists in a fixed way, waiting for us to uncover it. Instead, it hints that the universe and our awareness of it are entangled. But the observer effect is not limited to physics. It plays out in human psychology and behavior as well. People often act differently when they know they are being watched. A student performs better on an exam when supervised. An employee works harder when their boss is nearby. Athletes run faster in front of a crowd than when training alone. The presence of an observer changes the outcome. This is sometimes called the Hawthorne effect, where individuals improve their performance simply because they know they are being observed. The paradox emerges here too. The very act of studying behavior changes the behavior itself. Philosophically, the observer effect raises unsettling questions about reality and perception. Do we ever see the world as it truly is, or only as it appears under observation? If observation changes reality, can we ever claim to know an objective truth? The paradox suggests that perhaps there is no such thing as a fully detached observer. We are always participants in shaping the reality we study. On a deeper level, the observer effect connects to identity and self-awareness. Human beings are unique in that we do not just live, we watch ourselves living. We reflect on our thoughts, our feelings, our actions. But just like in physics, this self-observation changes the experience. When you become aware of your breathing, your breath changes. When you notice your emotions, they shift. When you observe your habits, they begin to transform. The paradox of observation is not only about science, it is about the human condition. To observe is to interfere, and to interfere is to change. This paradox also influences social life. People are shaped by the gaze of others. We dress differently when we are seen, speak differently when we are heard, and act differently when we are judged. Identity itself is often constructed through observation. We become who we think others see us as. The paradox reveals that observation is not passive, it is active, molding us into the people we present to the world. In this sense, our true selves may never be fully separate from the eyes watching us. Spiritually, the observer effect resonates with ancient teachings. Many traditions describe consciousness not as a passive mirror, but as a force that shapes reality. In Buddhism, awareness transforms suffering into wisdom. In Hinduism, the self is both observer and creator of the world. In modern mindfulness practice, observation without judgment leads to change, proving that awareness itself is transformative. The paradox of observation thus touches both the scientific and the mystical. To see is to alter, and to be seen is to be changed. Yet the paradox carries a tension. If observation changes reality, can we ever know reality as it truly is? Science strives for objectivity, but the observer effect reveals limits to that quest. Human beings too seek authenticity, but the act of observing ourselves often changes us. The paradox suggests that objectivity and authenticity may be ideals we can approach, but never fully grasp. Ultimately, the observer effect is not just a paradox of science, but a metaphor for life. It reminds us that we are not detached from the world we study or live in. We are participants. Our awareness shapes reality, and reality shapes our awareness. We are not separate from the universe, but deeply entangled with it. In the end, the observer effect teaches us a profound truth. To look is to touch, to watch is to change, and to be aware, where is to participate in the unfolding of reality. The paradox does not weaken our sense of truth. It deepens it, reminding us that knowledge is not about standing outside the world, but about living within it, shaping it with every act of observation. The Omnipotence Paradox. The Omnipotence Paradox is one of the most famous puzzles in philosophy of religion and logic, and it questions the very nature of absolute power. It asks, can an all-powerful being create a task so impossible that even they cannot accomplish it? For example, can an omnipotent God create a rock so heavy that he himself cannot lift it? If he can create such a rock, then there is something he cannot do: lift it. But if he cannot create such a rock, then there is also something he cannot do: create it. Either way, the idea of limitless power collapses into contradiction. The paradox challenges us to think about whether true omnipotence can logically exist at all. At first glance, the paradox seems like a clever trick, a linguistic trap meant to make fun of the concept of God. But the Omnipotence Paradox goes far deeper. It forces us to ask, what does it mean to be all-powerful? Does it mean being able to do absolutely anything, even the logically impossible, like creating square circles, or 2 + 2 = 5? Or does it mean being able to do all that is logically possible? If it is the latter, then omnipotence has limits, because it cannot violate logic itself. Yet, if it is the former, then omnipotence is incoherent, because contradictions destroy meaning. The paradox sits at the boundary where language, logic, and theology collide. The paradox has been debated for centuries by philosophers and theologians. Some argue that true omnipotence cannot include the logically absurd, because nonsense is not a thing to be done at all. Asking whether God can create a rock he cannot lift is like asking whether God can draw a four-sided triangle. It is not a limitation on power, but a misuse of words. Others, however, discuss and argue that if omnipotence has even one restriction, even the restriction of logic itself, then it is no longer truly infinite. The paradox remains unsolved, precisely because it forces us to wrestle with the boundaries of reason. This puzzle also raises questions about the relationship between power and freedom. If an all-powerful being can do anything, then he should also be able to limit himself. But if he limits himself, then he is no longer all-powerful. The paradox exposes the strange truth that unlimited power might contain within it the seeds of limitation. Absolute freedom may even destroy itself, because to be free to do everything includes being free to give up freedom. On a symbolic level, the Omnipotence Paradox reflects human struggles with control. We often dream of having unlimited power over our lives, to shape destiny, to conquer obstacles, to bend the world to our will. Yet, like the paradox, unlimited power often brings contradictions. With absolute freedom comes responsibility so heavy it can crush us. With endless choices comes paralysis. The paradox whispers that power, without wisdom and boundaries, may not be strength at all, but chaos. The paradox also carries psychological and spiritual depth. Many people wrestle with the concept of God. If God is all-powerful, why does suffering exist? Why is the world filled with injustice, pain, and imperfection? The Omnipotence Paradox does not answer these questions directly, but it sharpens them. If God can do anything, he could eliminate suffering. If he cannot, then his power is limited. If he chooses not to, then his goodness is questioned. The paradox forces us to confront the uneasy tension between divine power and human suffering. In modern thought, the paradox even extends beyond theology. It touches on the nature of systems, machines, and artificial intelligence. If we were to create a machine capable of doing absolutely anything, would it inevitably collapse into contradiction? Could true omnipotence exist even in principle, or does logic itself forbid it? The paradox shows us that some ideas, while seductive, may not be coherent. Yet the Omnipotence Paradox is not merely destructive, it is also illuminating. It teaches us that language has limits, and that not every combination of words points to a real possibility. It reminds us that power without wisdom, context, or structure may not be power at all, and it reveals that even the greatest concepts, infinity, divinity, omnipotence, are not immune to the questions of logic. Ultimately, the Omnipotence Paradox is less about disproving God and more about humbling human reason. It reminds us that when we speak of the infinite, our finite words and categories may falter. Perhaps true omnipotence is not about doing absurd impossibilities, but about embodying a kind of power beyond our comprehension. Or perhaps the paradox is unsolvable, a reminder that some mysteries lie forever beyond the grasp of logic. In the end, the Omnipotence Paradox invites us to wonder, can power truly be limitless? Or does the very concept of limitless break under its own weight? The paradox leaves us with awe, not only at the puzzle itself, but at the vastness of the questions it opens. It shows us that sometimes the deepest truths are not found in neat answers, but in the unending search for understanding. The paradox of meaning. The paradox of meaning is one of the most haunting and existential puzzles of human life. The more desperately we search for absolute universal meaning, the more it seems to slip through our fingers. Yet at the same time, when we stop grasping for ultimate answers and begin living with authenticity, love, and purpose, meaning often arises naturally. This paradox forces us to confront the strange truth that meaning is both essential and elusive, both constructed and discovered, both within us and beyond us. At the heart of the paradox lies a simple but profound question. What is the meaning of life? For centuries, philosophers, religions, and ordinary people have struggled with this. Some argue that life must have a higher, cosmic purpose, given by God, fate, or the universe itself. Others argue that life has no inherent meaning, that it is only matter and chance, and any sense of purpose is an illusion. The paradox arises because, as human beings, we cannot live without meaning. We crave it, build it, and shape our lives around it. Yet when we try to pin down one final universal meaning, certainty dissolves into mystery. The paradox can be seen in the writings of existentialist thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. Camus famously described life as absurd, a tension between our desire for meaning and the universe's silence. The more we demand that life answer us, the more it stares back with indifference. Yet Camus did not see this as despair, but as liberation. If life has no given meaning, then we are free to create our own. Meaning, paradoxically, is both absent and present, both denied and embraced. We also experience this paradox personally. When people chase meaning too directly, it often escapes them. For example, someone might throw themselves into religion, ideology, or career, hoping to find an absolute purpose. At first, it gives clarity, but over time, cracks appear. Doubts emerge, contradictions arise, and the certainty begins to waver. The harder they cling to meaning as something fixed, the more fragile it becomes. Yet when people loosen their grip, when they stop asking what is the ultimate purpose, and instead ask, how can I live fully, love deeply, and give authentically, meaning often emerges naturally. The paradox reveals that meaning is not always found by hunting for it, but by living into it. The paradox also reflects the fragility of language and symbols. Words like truth, purpose, and value are powerful, but they are human inventions, built to capture something far larger than themselves. When we push them too hard, they begin to collapse. For instance, if we say the meaning of life is happiness, we quickly see that happiness is temporary and subjective. If we say it is success, we realize success never satisfies completely. If we say it is love, we encounter the pain of loss. Every definition cracks under pressure. The paradox of meaning shows us that meaning may not be a final answer, but an ongoing relationship with existence itself. On a cultural level, the paradox is visible in modern society. Many people today live with more comfort, freedom, and opportunity than ever before, yet experience a deep crisis of meaning. With the decline of traditional belief systems and the rise of individualism, many feel lost. The paradox is sharp. When everything is possible, life feels empty. Too much freedom without grounding leaves us floating. Yet in small acts, raising children, creating art, helping others, seeking knowledge, people rediscover meaning. Life may not hand us a cosmic script, but it offers endless chances to write one for ourselves. Spiritually, the paradox takes different forms. Some traditions argue that meaning is beyond human comprehension, that it lies in the divine, the eternal, the infinite. Others argue that meaning is not discovered, but created, that it is our responsibility to live in such a way that life becomes meaningful. In both cases, the paradox is present. Meaning is both given and made, both beyond us and within us. Psychologically, the paradox also reflects the nature of human consciousness. We are the only creatures we know of that can ask, why? This question gives us power, but also burdens us with restlessness. A cat or a tree simply lives, but humans search for purpose. And yet, when we pause that restless search and live like the cat or the tree, present, engaged, alive, in the moment, meaning often arises without effort. The paradox teaches us that sometimes we find meaning not by demanding it, but by experiencing life as it is. Ultimately, the paradox of meaning teaches us that life's value cannot be reduced to a single formula. It is too vast, too fluid, too mysterious. Meaning is not a destination to be reached, but a horizon that moves as we move. It grows when we love, shrinks when we despair, and transforms as we live. To demand an ultimate answer may only deepen our confusion, but to embrace the paradox, to live fully in a world where meaning is both fragile and infinite, is to find freedom. In the end, the paradox whispers a strange truth. Life may have no final meaning, and yet it may have infinite meaning. The absence of a universal purpose does not diminish life. It magnifies it, giving us the freedom to create, to love, to give, and to live with courage. The paradox of meaning leaves us not with despair, but with awe, for perhaps meaning is not something to be solved, but something to be lived. The Immortality Paradox. The Immortality Paradox is one of the most profound and unsettling puzzles about human existence. At first glance, immortality, the promise of never dying, seems like the ultimate gift. Death is the great fear, the shadow that haunts every life, the boundary that makes our time finite. To escape death, to live forever, appears to be the answer to our deepest longing. Yet the paradox reveals a troubling truth. If we lived forever, life itself might lose its meaning. Immortality, rather than being a blessing, could become a curse. The very things that make life precious, urgency, change, impermanence, would vanish, leaving behind an eternity stripped of purpose. To see the paradox more clearly, consider how we experience time. A birthday feels special because it happens only once a year. A reunion is moving because it may not happen again for a long time. Love feels powerful because we know we cannot hold it forever. Life itself feels urgent because we know it will one day end. Death, though feared, gives shape and weight to existence. Without it, everything risks becoming endless repetition. If you had infinite tomorrows, why value today? If there were no final chapter, would the story still matter? The paradox shows us that death, the thing we most fear, may also be the very thing that gives life meaning. Philosophers and writers have explored this paradox for centuries. Bernard Williams argued that immortality would eventually lead to unbearable boredom. Even if life were filled with pleasures, over an infinite timeline, every joy would eventually lose its flavor. Food would taste dull, relationships would grow stale, and even the greatest adventures would become routine. Eternal life might begin as bliss, but end as endless monotony. The paradox is cruel. What we think of as ultimate happiness may slowly transform into eternal emptiness. Yet the paradox is not only about boredom, it is also about identity. Over time, people change, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually. Across centuries, an immortal being would transform so completely that they may no longer resemble their original self. After thousands of years, would you still be you? Or would immortality dissolve identity, leaving behind not one continuous life, but countless selves strung across eternity? The paradox suggests that immortality might not preserve the self, but erode it. Religions and myths also wrestle with this paradox. Many traditions promise eternal life, but often not in the form of endless earthly existence. Instead, immortality is imagined as transcendence, union with God, liberation from the cycle of suffering, or entry into a realm beyond time. Perhaps this reflects an ancient recognition of the paradox, that living forever in this world may not be desirable, but living beyond the limitations of this world might hold a different kind of meaning. In modern times, the immortality paradox reappears in science and technology. Advances in medicine, genetics, and artificial intelligence raise the possibility of radically extending life. Some even dream of digital immortality, uploading consciousness into machines to escape the limits of biology. But here the paradox strikes again. Even if we succeed, would eternal digital existence feel like life or like imprisonment? Would endless survival be liberation or slavery to monotony? The paradox warns that in seeking to defeat death, we may lose the essence of what makes life alive. On a personal level, the paradox touches our deepest fears and desires. We fear death, yet we also fear the idea of eternity. We want more time, but we also know that time without end may strip life of urgency. The paradox teaches us that meaning may not come from quantity of years, but from kityu, duality of experience. A short life lived fully may be richer than an endless life drained of wonder. Mortality forces us to cherish moments precisely because they pass. Spiritually and psychologically, the immortality paradox reminds us to embrace impermanence. The falling of leaves, the fading of seasons, the passing of loved ones. All of these bring sorrow, yet they also give beauty to existence. Without death, there would be no seasons, no urgency to love, no reason to grow. Impermanence creates the very conditions that make life precious. The paradox reveals that death is not merely an enemy to be feared, but also a hidden teacher. Ultimately, the immortality paradox does not give us neat answers. It leaves us with a tension. We long to escape death, but we also need death to make life meaningful. Perhaps the wisdom lies in accepting both truths, in cherishing the gift of life not because it is endless, but because it is fleeting. In the end, the paradox teaches us that life's value is not measured in its length, but in its depth. Immortality may promise eternity, but mortality gives us urgency, love, meaning, and beauty. The paradox whispers that death, far from destroying life's meaning, may be the very thing that makes it possible